The first time my father called me an impostor, he didn't scream. He said it very softly, and that quiet way he said it, that's what was truly terrifying. Natalie Cross is not my daughter, he said, not looking at the judge but right at me. She faked her entire career. She never set foot on any naval base. I can still remember the smell of the floor cleaner in the Boston Federal Courthouse, ammonia mixed with sweat and old paper. The cold from the air conditioning blew directly on the back of my neck for 2 straight hours. Then my lawyer, Dr. Vanessa Okonkwo, placed a brown leather briefcase on the table. She unlatched it. Inside was a thick file with a red cover. In the bottom right corner were the words, "Classified document for federal judge eyes only." Judge Arthur Brennan put on his glasses. He picked up the file. He didn't open it right away. He looked at me first. A look that lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was long enough for me to know he was wondering if I was really the person those papers said I was. Then he opened it. He read the first page, flipped to the second, then the third. When he looked up, his expression hadn't changed, but his voice had. "I'd like counsel for both sides to approach the bench," he said. And all I could think was, "Dad, I didn't want this, but you asked for it." My father sat on the other side of the room, his face pale, and for the first time in my life I saw that he didn't know what to say next. Weymouth, Massachusetts isn't the kind of place you dream about as a kid. It doesn't look like the postcards they sell at the roadside bookstore. No quaint houses with white columns. No romantic harbor with sailboats bobbing in the wind. Weymouth is an old industrial town along the Fore River, where the main colors are the gray of concrete, the gray of a winter sky, and the gray of smoke from the shipyard. I grew up there in a small, faded white house, about a 10-minute walk from the river, close enough to hear the ship horns every morning. Far enough not to smell the machine oil all day. My father, Harold Cross, worked at the Fore River shipyard for 38 years. He started at 18 right after high school and retired on the day he turned 56. 38 years in the same place, with the same kind of work, the same walk from the factory gate to the parking lot. He didn't complain. He wasn't proud either. He just worked, came home, sat and watched TV, went to bed, and did it all over again. There's a saying I read somewhere, something like, "The quietest men often carry the biggest storms inside them." I don't know if my father had any storms. If he did, he never let me see them. When I was little, I thought he hated me, but later when I was older, I realized hate was too strong a word and too simple. He didn't hate me. He just didn't know what to do with me. My father didn't hit, he didn't yell, he was just silent. And there was something in his silence that was heavier than any cruel word. When someone yells at you, you can yell back, you can cry. You can slam a door and feel like you've done something, but when someone is silent, you have nothing to hold on to, nothing to fight against. You just stand there wondering if you're imagining the whole thing. When I was 11 years old, my shop class had a woodworking project. Each kid got a piece of plywood, a handsaw, some glue, and was told to make something. Most of my friends made picture frames. The boys made cars or planes. I made a boat. I don't know why I chose to make a boat. Maybe because of the river. Maybe because of the ships my father built at the factory. Maybe because I thought if I made something related to his work, he would look at me differently. That boat was ugly. The sides weren't straight, the bow was crooked, and the excess glue hardened into clear drops like tears. But it was the first thing in my life I'd made with my own 2 hands, from start to finish, with no help. I brought it home, breathless with joy. My father was at the dining table, reading the local paper. I put the boat on the newspaper right in front of him. "I made this for you," I said. My voice was trembling with excitement. My father looked at the boat. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands for about 5 seconds. Then he put it on the bookshelf near the window. "Yeah," he said, and went back to his paper. "No thank you. No, it's beautiful, honey." Not a pat on the head or a smile, just yeah. 3 years later, when I was 14, I was cleaning the living room one Sunday afternoon. My mom told me to dust the bookshelf. As I took down each book, I saw the boat. It was still there, still in the exact same spot my father had put it 3 years ago, covered in dust. I picked it up. It was even uglier than I remembered, and for a moment I thought, my father kept it. He didn't throw it away. Maybe that means he cares. But then another thought came, a colder one. He didn't throw it away because he never saw it. It just sat there on the shelf between the old books, forgotten. Just like everything else in his life. I quietly dropped it in the trash before I finished dusting the shelf. My mother saw me do it. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand on my shoulder, gave it a gentle squeeze, and went into the kitchen. That's what I remember most about my father. Not the things he did, but the things he didn't do. My brother Derek was 3 years older than me. Derek wasn't smarter than me. Derek wasn't more hardworking than me. Derek wasn't even better looking than me, though if you asked him he'd say otherwise. But Derek was the boy. And in my father's house, that explained everything. When Derek was 19, he crashed my father's truck into a lamppost near the intersection on Main Street. No one was hurt. But the front end was smashed in, and it took 2 weeks to get it out of the repair shop. My father was furious. He yelled at Derek for a whole day. Do you have any idea how long I worked to buy that truck? Do you know what respect is? Derek hung his head, mumbled an apology. And after a day it was over. No one ever mentioned it again. When I was 17, the washing machine broke. It was making a grinding noise, wouldn't drain, and a flood of soap suds spilled onto the floor. My father was about to call a repairman, but I told him to let me take a look. I undid a few screws, took out the drain pump, and found a sock stuck in the hose. I pulled it out, put everything back together, and the machine ran perfectly. I was so proud I went to the kitchen and told my father I fixed it. It was just clogged. My father looked at me. He didn't say good job, he said. Who told you to touch it? I bet it's not fixed for good. If it breaks down again in a few days, you're responsible. And he brought it up for 3 months. Every time the washer ran, he'd shake his head. Messed with it herself, who knows what else she broke. 3 months. Every time we did laundry. 3 months. I didn't need my father to praise me. I just needed him to stop reminding me, over and over, that I might have done something wrong. But my mother was different. My mother, Marilyn, was the head nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital, about a 20-minute drive from Weymouth. She worked the night shift for 25 years. Not because she liked it, because the night shift paid more, and her family needed every dollar. I grew up with the image of my mother coming home at 6 in the morning, when it was still dark in the winter or just getting light in the summer. She'd take off her coat, set her black medical bag down by the door, and walk into the kitchen. And before she did anything else, she would stand at the sink and wash her hands thoroughly. I could smell the eucalyptus from the special soap the hospital used. It clung to her skin, mixed with the smell of coffee and the exhaustion of a long night on duty. To me, that was the smell of sacrifice. Not something heroic, just the smell of eucalyptus at 6 in the morning, when the kids were getting ready for school. And their mother had just come home after 12 hours of taking care of other people. My mother never argued with my father in front of us. Not once. I don't know if it was patience or exhaustion or an unspoken contract between them that I was never allowed to read. But some nights when I was supposed to be asleep, I'd wake up to a faint noise from the back of the house. I would step into the hall and look through the crack of the window at the end of the passage, and I'd see my mom sitting on the back steps. She'd be wearing her old blue sweater, a cigarette burning between her fingers. She didn't smoke much, just one, maybe two, on the nights she couldn't sleep. My mother would sit there, looking out at the Fore River where the moonlight reflected on the water black as oil. She didn't cry, she didn't sigh, she just looked. And I, from the shadows of the hallway, would watch her. We never said a word to each other in those moments. But I knew my mother was carrying some kind of weight, something she would never share with me. And at 12, 13, 14 years old, I wasn't old enough to understand what it was. I just knew there was a quiet sadness in that house, and it didn't come from my father. It came from the absence of something I'd never even had. Years later, as a grown woman, I would wonder if my mother was happy, and I realized I didn't know the answer. She gave me everything she had. But she never told me she was okay, and I never asked. That was the town of Weymouth. That was my father, that was my mother, that was my brother, and that was me before I became someone else. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone. I didn't join the Navy out of patriotism. I didn't stand in front of the mirror at 17 and think I wanted to defend my country. I didn't watch movies about the Marines and see myself in them. I didn't have a grandfather who'd in World War II. I didn't have a military tradition in my family. My father used to say that daughters didn't need to be strong. Daughters needed stability, a good husband, a job close to home so they could be there if something happened. That wasn't advice. It was a boundary, drawn before I ever had the chance to ask if I wanted to step outside it. I joined the Navy because I needed a place where me being a girl wasn't a problem to be solved. I thought the Navy was that place. I was partly right and partly wrong. I enlisted right after high school. My father didn't say anything when I showed him the commitment papers. He read them, put them down on the table, and asked, "What about college?" I told him the Navy would pay for it later. He shook his head. "Girls go to school to find a husband. What are you going for?" I didn't answer that question, because the real answer was too long and I knew he wouldn't listen. My mother was different. When I told her, she was silent for a long time. Then she asked, "Are you sure?" I said yes. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just nodded. I trust you, she said, and that was all I needed. Basic training at Great Lakes, Illinois. The first 3 months of my life where no one asked if I was Harold Cross's daughter. No one asked if I knew how to fix a washing machine. No one asked me why I wasn't at home like the other girls. They just asked how far I could run, how much I could carry, and how long I could endure. And I did. After basic training, I was selected for the Signals Intelligence Program, SIGINT, we call it in the service. My job later on, and I'll tell you about it, wasn't something you see in the movies. There was no me holding a rifle and crawling through mud, no me parachuting into a dense jungle, no me wrestling with a spy on the roof of a skyscraper. My job was to sit in a windowless room, wearing headphones, staring at a screen, listen, analyze, document, repeat for 12 hours straight. Take a 30-minute break for a sandwich and a coffee, and then listen, analyze, document all over again. There were days I wondered if I was doing anything meaningful. You sit in a sealed room, your ears aching from the white noise, your eyes blurry from the blue light of the screen, and you wonder, does anyone know I'm here? Does anyone know what I'm doing? Or am I just a tiny gear in a massive machine that I can't even see the shape of? Once I told an old friend from high school about my job. She asked me if I got to carry a gun. I said no. She asked if I got to jump out of planes. I said no. She looked at me with this disappointed expression, like I'd just told her I was an accountant for the CIA. I laugh when I tell that story, but there's a sad truth in it. We grow up with these glamorous images of the military. Brave soldiers, dangerous missions, breathtaking action sequences, and then when you actually do it, you realize that most of the work in the military, even in intelligence, is patience. It's sitting still and waiting. It's one faint voice in 1,000 hours of recordings. It's one tiny detail that someone else might miss, but you can't. And it was a small detail just like that which changed how I saw my job. In my 3rd year, I was assigned to a base in Europe. I can't tell you where exactly, but I can tell you that I sat in a room, wore headphones, and listened to calls from a network my superiors called a special cargo transport network. It was only much later that I learned its real name, human trafficking. There was one voice I can't forget. A man's voice, speaking a language I didn't understand, but through his cadence, his breathing, through the silences between sentences, I could feel an urgency, a tension, and something much darker. I documented the frequency, the time, the length of the call, the repeated keywords. I sent the report up the chain. I didn't think much of it, it was just the job. A month later, I got an internal email. It was very short, just a few lines, but I remember every word, based on information from your analysis. A target was identified and a victim was rescued. The victim is female, 14 years old, named Anna, now safe with her family at an undisclosed location. I read that email 3 times. I had never met Anna. I didn't know what she looked like. I didn't know what language she spoke. I didn't know what she'd been through before she was found. I just knew her name and that she was home. That night I went out to the mess hall, got a cup of coffee, and sat looking out at the parking lot in the dark. It was cold. My breath made white clouds in the air and I cried. Not from sadness, not from joy. It was for a jumble of feelings that I didn't have a name for. That was the first time I understood that my work mattered. Not because I got a commendation. Not because someone patted me on the back. But because a child I would never meet was sleeping in her own bed that night, instead of in the back of a truck, on some road no one would ever know. I couldn't call my mother to tell her this. That was one of the hardest things about my job. The required silence. My mother knew I was in the Navy. She knew I worked with computers and headphones. That was all I could say. Admin, I lied. I do admin work. My mother didn't ask for more. Maybe she knew I couldn't say. Maybe she figured that if her daughter had to keep secrets, there must have been a reason. But I never knew what she thought, and now I can never ask. My mother died in my 8th year of service. I was in Virginia when I got the call from Derek. His voice was strange, none of his usual teasing. "Mom's gone," he said, "last night, in her sleep." I just stood there, holding the phone, listening to Derek talk about the funeral, about Dad, about the neighbors bringing over food. But I wasn't really listening. Because in my head, one question was playing over and over, an endless loop. Was she proud of me? My mother never told me that, not in so many words. Not because she didn't want to, but because I never gave her the chance. I always thought there would be time. That one day, when I was out of the service, when I could tell her everything, I would sit down next to her, pour her a cup of tea, and tell her about Anna, about the long nights in the windowless room, about everything I had kept secret for all those years. But time ran out before I even realized it was passing. I couldn't tell my mother that I did important things. I couldn't tell her that there was a girl named Anna alive because of my work. And because I couldn't tell her, my mother died with the only understanding she had, that her daughter did admin work in the Navy. Sometimes I wonder if that was enough for her. I will never have the answer. And maybe that's the sharpest pain I carry. Not that I lost my mother, but that I never got to show her who I was before she was gone. I got the news my mom had heart failure on a March morning. I was on shift, headphones still on, when I saw my phone light up. A text from Derek, "Mom's in the hospital," said to call. I called right away. Mom sounded tired, but her voice was still warm. "It's nothing, honey," she said. "Just an old heart getting weak. The doctor says the medicine will take care of it." I believed that. I wanted to believe that. 2 months later, I requested an extended leave of absence. My commanding officer asked why. I told him my mother was sick. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "How long?" "I don't know, sir," I said. "All right," he replied. "Go, family comes first." Those were words I had never heard from my father's mouth. Family comes first. It was easier for a stranger to say it than the man who brought me into this world. The last time I spoke to my mother on the phone, I was at a base in Virginia. She asked, "Are you coming home for Christmas this year?" I said, "Yes, Mom, I'll be there." There was a pause. Then she said, her voice light, not accusing, just a simple observation. "You've said yes for 10 years now, Nat." I didn't know what to say. I just mumbled something and ended the call. Afterward, I went into the bathroom, sat down on the floor, and I cried. Cried because my mother had waited for me for 10 years, and I still hadn't come home. I didn't make it home in time. My mother passed away 2 months before I finalized my early discharge papers. 2 months, 61 days. Enough time for me to have said goodbye if I had just left sooner. If I hadn't thought I needed to complete one last mission, if I hadn't thought she would wait. But she didn't wait, and that was my fault. I flew from Norfolk to Logan Airport on a late autumn afternoon. It was raining. Of course it was raining. Boston in November is always raining, as if the city is crying for those who can't. I stood in the arrivals area, looking around for my dad or Derek. I didn't see anyone. I called Derek. He didn't pick up. I called my dad. He answered on the 5th ring. "Where are you?" I asked. "At home," he said. "Aren't you coming to get me?" "Take the bus," he said, and hung up. I stood there for a long time, holding the phone in my hand, letting other passengers push past me. The rain streaked down the glass roof of the terminal, long trails like slow-motion tears. I took the bus, 2.5 hours from Logan to Weymouth. I sat by the window, watching the bare trees, the gray houses, the empty shopping centers. I remember thinking, I'm home, but I don't belong here anymore. When the bus stopped at the final station, I got off, dragged my suitcase through a puddle, and walked to the White House on Elm Street. I stood at the front door. The rain was still coming down. My coat was soaked. My hair was plastered to my cheeks. I knocked. No one opened. I knocked again, harder this time. My father opened the door. He just stood there, wearing an old gray sweater, his hair much grayer than I remembered. He looked me up and down, a look that held nothing but recognition. Then he said, "You're late. Not you're home. Not come in out of the cold, not I missed you. Just, you're late," as if I were a missed bus. He turned his back, walked inside, and left me standing there on the doorstep, the rain still falling, my suitcase by my side, my coat still wet. That was the first time I understood. Coming home doesn't mean you're welcome. My mother's funeral had been held 2 months before I got back. I didn't get to be there. I didn't get to hear the eulogies. I didn't get to see her one last time. All I had was an urn of ashes on the fireplace mantel, next to a photo of her in a blue nurse's uniform, smiling at someone just out of frame. I sat on the couch across from that urn for 3 straight hours, not speaking, not crying, just looking. My father was in the kitchen, drinking coffee and watching TV. Derek wasn't home. Later, my mother's lawyer called. She told me to come to her office for the reading of the will. I thought it was just a formality. I had no idea the letter my mother left would change everything. My mother left the house and her savings to me and Derek. But it wasn't an even split. She wrote that Natalie would have discretion over the majority of the assets. Derek received a fixed amount, enough to pay off his debts and start over. I would decide the rest. In the letter she left just for me, she wrote, "Nat, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I want you to know I'm not doing this because I love Derek any less. I love Derek, but I know my son will never learn to stand on his own if someone is always there to catch him. But you, Nat, you have stood on your own your entire life. I saw you do it since you were 11 years old, when you made that ugly little wooden boat and brought it home for your father. He didn't say anything, but I saw it. I always saw you. I trust you. And I want you to have the power to choose, even if that choice hurts someone." I read that letter 5 times in a row. 5 times, and each time I could see my mother sitting on the back steps, looking out at the river, a cigarette in her hand. I could see her keeping silent to hold this family together. I could see how much she had sacrificed, how much she had endured, without a single word of complaint. That was the last time I heard my mother's voice. Not over the phone, not in a real conversation, but through the words on a pale yellow piece of paper folded carefully inside a small envelope. And that letter, my mother's final words, was the beginning of everything that fell apart. Because my father didn't know about the letter, and when he found out that I, the daughter he never thought was good enough, had control over the family's assets, something inside him changed. It wasn't a big sudden change, it was a slow hidden fracture, like a crack in a wall that gets a little longer each day, until one day you look up and realize the wall isn't as solid as you thought. My father started talking about fairness. He said Mom wasn't in her right mind when she wrote the will. He said I had influenced her. He said that I had left home, that I wasn't there for her in her final years, so what right did I have to get more than Derek? I didn't argue, I was too tired to argue. I thought that time would calm him down. I was wrong. 2 months later, I received a summons from federal court. My father was suing me. And it wasn't just about the inheritance. He was suing me for something else, something far more cruel. He alleged that I had falsified my military records, that my achievements weren't real, that I was never the person I told my mother I was. When I read those words, I couldn't breathe. Not because I was afraid of being found out. There was nothing to find out. It was because my father, the man who had been silent my entire life, had chosen this moment to speak, and his words weren't meant to protect his family. They were meant to destroy his own daughter. I received the summons on a Tuesday afternoon. I was living in a rented apartment in Quincy, Massachusetts, a small city just outside Boston. My place was on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot of an old supermarket. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't fancy, but it was where I started over after my discharge, and I'd grown used to the sight of abandoned shopping carts from my living room window. The letter came by registered mail. The mailman rang my bell at 3 p.m. I signed for it, took the brown envelope, and didn't open it right away. I set it on the table, went to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, drank half of it, and only then did I pick it up and open it. Inside was a summons from the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts. I read the first line, then the second. Then I stopped, set the paper down on the table, and looked out the window. The parking lot was empty. A white truck was parked in the far corner, no one inside. Gray clouds drifted across a low sky. I picked the paper back up and read it again from the beginning. The words hadn't changed. My father, Harold Cross, was suing me. Not for property, directly, although that was in there too, but for something else. Fraudulent misrepresentation of military service for financial gain from an inheritance. I read that phrase 3 times to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. According to the filing, my father alleged that I had never achieved the rank I'd told my mother I had. That I had exaggerated my accomplishments over 14 years of service. That I had deliberately constructed a false narrative of my career, so my mother would believe I deserved to be favored in her will. To put it simply, he was saying I was a fraud, that what I did in the Navy was a lie, that my rank was a lie, that my mother had been fooled by me. I couldn't breathe. Not because I was scared, I knew where the truth was, but because I couldn't understand it. This man, my father, who had been silent for 38 years in the shipyard, who had never given me a single compliment my entire childhood, who told me that girls didn't need to be strong, he had taken the time to sit down, write this petition, hire a lawyer, and take me to court. For the house, for the money my mother left, and for something deeper that I didn't want to look at directly. I called Derek. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up. I knew what those 4 rings meant. On a normal call, Derek usually answered after 2. 4 rings meant he was hesitating, debating whether or not to answer. Hello, his voice was raspy. I just got the summons, I said, getting straight to the point. You knew about this, didn't you? Silence. You found out, Derek asked, his voice lacking any surprise. Found out what? I just told you I got a summons. The lawsuit, he said. Dad said he was going to tell you, but I thought you should read it for yourself. I held my breath. How long have you known? Silence again, longer this time. A month, Derek whispered. I couldn't speak for a few seconds. A month. Derek had known for a month and didn't tell me. A month. While I was sitting in this apartment, thinking things were finally settling down, my father and my brother were quietly preparing a legal battle against me. Whose side are you on? I asked. I knew the question was unfair the moment it left my lips, but I needed to hear the answer. Derek sighed, a long heavy breath as if he'd been carrying a weight for too long. I can't choose you, Nat, he said. Dad's paying my rent. He pays my utility bills, he buys my groceries when I'm out of work. I can't. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. I understood. Derek, my older brother, the one my father had always coddled, always protected, always pulled back up every time he fell. He couldn't side with me because he would lose everything. His loyalty wasn't love, it was dependence. I can't choose you, those words meant he had already chosen. Just not me. You know I didn't do the things he's accusing me of, right? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I know, Derek said, his voice barely audible. But I can't help you, Nat, I'm sorry. I hung up. I wasn't angry at Derek, I really couldn't be. When you watch someone drown their whole life, and then they choose to stay in the mud because they never learned how to swim, you can't be angry. You just feel sorry for them. Derek never learned how to live without our father. And now at nearly 40, he was still the 19-year-old kid who crashed the truck and waited for Dad's forgiveness. I called a lawyer the next morning. Vanessa Okonkwo. A friend from the Navy had recommended her. She'd been a federal prosecutor before opening her own firm. A woman with her hair in a tight bun and amber-colored eyes. When I first met her in her office in downtown Boston, she told me, "Tell me everything. And don't lie, I can smell a lie from a mile away." So I told her, from beginning to end, about Weymouth, about my father, about my mother, about Derek, about the Navy, about what I really did for 14 years. Vanessa listened without interrupting. When I was finished, she asked, "Do you have proof?" "Yes," I said, "but most of it is classified." "What percentage?" "About 70%. Vanessa sat still for a few seconds. Then she smiled. Her smile wasn't comforting. It was the smile of someone who had just found a crack in her opponent's armor. "Then the other side is digging their own grave," she said. "They're accusing you of fraud without realizing the proof of the truth is protected by the federal government." I asked Vanessa, should I just settle? Give them the house, the money, just to make it end? She looked at me. "Do you want to do that?" "I don't need the house," I said. "I don't need the money. I've been making my own way for a long time." "Then why don't you settle?" I was silent. In my head, the answer had formed long before I could put it into words, and when I spoke, my voice didn't tremble, but my heart did. "Because I can't let him say I'm a fraud," I said. "My mother believed in me. She spent her whole life believing that I was the daughter she raised. If I admit guilt even just by settling, it means I'm saying my mother was wrong, and she wasn't wrong." Vanessa looked at me for a long time, then she nodded. "Okay," she said. "Then we'll win." She placed her hand on the file on her desk, looked me straight in the eye, and said the words I would never forget. "But you need to understand something, Natalie. Winning in court doesn't mean you win your father. You can get a judgment in your favor. You can make him pay money. But you will never be able to make him apologize. Can you accept that?" I didn't answer right away. Because deep down a part of me, the little 11-year-old girl holding the wooden boat in her hands, was still hoping that my father would change. But I was 36 years old, and I knew that hope isn't always a good thing. "I accept," I said. Vanessa opened the first file, and the battle officially began. Vanessa didn't waste any time. A week after our first meeting, she sent me a long list of documents to provide: commendations, annual performance reviews, supervisor evaluations, course completion certificates. Anything that could prove I did what I said I did. I spent all of Sunday digging through boxes in the back of my closet, finding every piece of paper, arranging them chronologically, putting them in a binder, and bringing them to Vanessa's office on Monday morning. She sat and read in silence for about 15 minutes. I sat across from her, looking at the potted plants on the windowsill, at the degrees hanging on the wall, looking at anything to avoid looking at her face while she read. I was used to silence from a young age, but the silence in a lawyer's office is different. It has weight, it has judgment. Finally, Vanessa looked up. She pushed the binder toward me, shaking her head. "The other side will say these are fake," she said. "Commendations can be printed from a computer. Performance reviews can be forged. So can supervisor evaluations. Do you have anything else, Natalie? Something that no one could possibly fake?" I sat in silence. And then I remembered. The small room in the secure area at the Norfolk base. The day before I was discharged, a senior officer, I can't say his name, but I clearly remember his rank and the way he walked into the room, called me in. He closed the door, pulled the blinds, then from a safe he took out a thick file with a red cover. "You participated in 3 missions classified at the highest level," he said, his voice low and steady, as if he were reading a report. "These missions are protected by the National Security Act. You are not permitted to speak about them to anyone, including your family." I nodded. I already knew that. He put the file on the table. "This is the complete record of those missions. It includes your analysis, the reports you submitted to your superiors, and confirmation from the Department of Defense on the intelligence value of the information you provided." I looked at the file, red cover, black letters, classified meant top secret, to be opened by a federal judge only. You will keep this file, he said. Keep it somewhere safe. If anyone at all questions what you did or doubts the authenticity of your career, you give this file to a federal judge, not to the opposing counsel, not to the press, only the judge. They will know what to do. I asked, Sir, will I ever have to use it? He looked at me. His eyes were gray without emotion. You hope not, he said, but you keep it, just in case. I kept that file in a black metal box under a pile of linens in my bedroom closet. I never opened it, not once. Because a part of me thought that if I didn't open it, it would mean I would never need it. The naivety of a person who was all too used to hiding parts of her life. I told Vanessa about the file. She looked at me. Where is it now? At home, in my closet. Go get it. Bring it here as soon as you can. I drove home to Quincy in the afternoon rain, opened the closet, took out the black metal box. I sat on my bed and looked at it for a long time. I still didn't open it. I brought the box to Vanessa's office at 6 p.m. She was still working, the desk lamp was on, her coffee cup was empty, and documents were spread across the table. I put the box down. Vanessa looked at it, then at me. Do you want to wait outside? She asked. No, I said. I want to stay. She nodded. She unlocked the box, took out the red file. She looked at the warning on the cover, then slowly opened the first page. I sat across from her, hands on my knees, back straight, the posture of a soldier in a waiting room. Outside, the rain was still falling. I could hear the water running from the eaves, the sound of traffic on Washington Street, the sound of the world going on outside this closed door. Vanessa read. She read the first page, turned to the second, then the third, then the fourth. She didn't say a word. 10 minutes went by, then 20. I started to wonder if something was wrong, if the file was what I thought it was, if it was strong enough to protect me. Finally, Vanessa looked up. She set the file down on the table, took off her glasses, and looked at me. Her gaze was no longer that of a lawyer looking at a client. It was the look of someone who had just seen something much bigger than they'd imagined. You know they're digging their own grave, right? She said, her voice very soft. I didn't answer. Harold Cross, his lawyer, their entire legal team, they have no idea what's in this file, Vanessa continued. They think they're suing a regular veteran with a few questionable achievements. They don't know you were involved in missions protected at a national level. She turned another page. There's the signature of a vice admiral here, and a document from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Natalie, this doesn't just prove your innocence. It could expose Harold and his lawyer to criminal charges for bringing false accusations involving protected information to court. I said, I don't want to use this. Vanessa stared at me. What? I don't want to use it, I repeated. I don't want to present this file in court. I don't want my father to face criminal charges. I just want him to stop. I just want him to look at me and admit that I did the things I said I did. I don't want to destroy him. Vanessa was silent for a moment. Then why did you keep it? She asked. If you didn't want to use it, why didn't you throw it away after you left the service? Why did you keep it in a metal box, carry it from Virginia to Massachusetts, and hide it in your closet all these years? I didn't answer. But in my head, the answer had been there for a long time. It had been there since the day I was 11, standing in front of the bookshelf in the living room, looking at that dust-covered wooden boat. It had been there since the day I threw the boat in the trash, and my mother just placed a hand on my shoulder, saying nothing. The answer was, because I was hoping I would never have to use it. I was hoping my father would change, that he would see what I had done, that he would be proud just once. That I wouldn't need a red-jacketed file signed by a vice admiral to prove I was worthy of his recognition. I had kept it all these years as a final insurance policy, an escape hatch I prayed I would never have to walk through. But now my father had pushed me to the edge, and that door was swinging open. Vanessa, I said, if I have to use it I will, but only if there is no other way. Vanessa looked at me for a long time. Then she closed the file, placed it back in the metal box, and pushed it toward me. This is your weapon, she said. Take it home, keep it somewhere safe. Let's hope you don't have to use it. But if the time comes when you do, don't hesitate, because if you hesitate, they will win. And you know what that means. I knew. If they won, my father would tell the world I was a fraud, and my mother, who had trusted me, would become the one who had been fooled. I couldn't let that happen. Not for my sake, for hers. I've been in a lot of secure rooms in my life, rooms with no windows, soundproof walls, and flickering fluorescent lights. I've spent thousands of hours in rooms like that, wearing a headset, listening to foreign voices. I learned to stay calm when everything around me was heating up. But I had never stepped into a federal courtroom before. Judge Arthur Brennan's courtroom in the Boston Federal Courthouse was on the 5th floor, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling. The light wasn't from fluorescent bulbs but from brass chandeliers, casting a pale yellow light that was warm but also cold in a way. It was like the light in a museum, illuminating priceless but dead artifacts. The air conditioner hummed with a steady rhythm, like the room's artificial heartbeat. I could smell old paper, that scent of documents that have existed for years, been bound, opened, closed, stored in cabinets, taken out and bound again. And faintly in the air was the scent of someone's perfume from the gallery behind me. A sweet out-of-place scent of jasmine amidst the smell of paper and old wood. I sat at the defendant's table next to Vanessa. She wore a charcoal gray suit, her hair in a tight bun without a single stray strand. In front of her was the black metal box, still closed. On the other side of the room, my father sat next to his lawyer, Bradley Frost. A man in his 40s with slick-back blonde hair, a light gray suit, and a red tie. He looked like he'd just stepped out of an ad for an expensive law firm. Frost had a very pleasant voice. That was the scary part. When he stood up to begin his questioning, his voice was soft and deep like a radio host reading the morning news. There was no aggression, no accusatory tone. Just a cold politeness, as if he were asking me about the weather. "Miss Cross," Frost began, walking slowly toward my table, "could you please tell the court how long you served in the Navy?" 14 years, I said. "And what rank did you achieve?" "Lieutenant Commander." "Lieutenant Commander," Frost repeated, as if tasting each syllable. "A high rank, not everyone achieves that." I said nothing. Frost stopped in front of me, his hands clasped behind his back. "And during those 14 years, can you provide verifiable evidence of the missions you participated in?" I looked at Vanessa. She gave a slight nod. "Mr. Frost," I said, "some of my missions are classified under orders from the Department of Defense. I am not permitted to disclose the details." Frost smiled, a perfect even smile like it came from a mold. "Are you saying you have no proof?" Vanessa was on her feet in an instant. "Your Honor," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it silenced the room. "Counselor Frost appears to be deliberately misconstruing my client's testimony. There is a vast difference between no proof and classified proof. I suggest Mr. Frost reacquaint himself with the National Security Information Act before asking questions that could mislead this court." Judge Brennan looked at Frost. "Do you have a response, Mr. Frost?" Frost was silent for a second. Just long enough for me to see he was slightly flustered. But then he smiled again. "No response, Your Honor. I'd like to call my next witness." The next witness was my father. Harold Cross walked to the witness stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I watched him. He wore a dark blue suit I'd never seen before. He probably bought it for the occasion. White shirt, gray tie. He looked more respectable than I had ever seen him, but his eyes were the same. Still that same cold, sharp gaze I'd known since childhood. Frost began the questioning. "Mr. Cross, would you please tell the court about the relationship between you and your daughter, Ms. Natalie Cross?" My father looked at me. For the first time that day, his eyes met mine. "Not good," he said. "She left home when she was young. Then she abandoned her mother when she got sick." I felt Vanessa's hand on my arm, a gentle squeeze grounding me. "She always thought she was better than everyone," my father continued. "Been that way since she was a kid. Building wooden boats, fixing washing machines, then joining the Navy. Always trying to prove something. But when her mother needed her most, she wasn't there." Frost nodded. "Do you know what your daughter did in the Navy?" My father shrugged. "She had a desk job. Sat behind a computer, wore a headset, nothing special. She'd bragged to her mother about all sorts of things, but I knew the truth." Vanessa rose to her feet. "Mr. Cross," she said, stepping forward, "do you have any evidence for what you've just stated?" My father looked at her. "She's the one who said it." "Your own daughter told you she had a desk job?" "Yes." "And you're using the word of the very person you are suing to conclude that she is not to be trusted." My father fell silent. His face began to flush. Starting at his neck, it crept up his cheeks all the way to the rims of his ears, the color of anger. But also the color of embarrassment, because Vanessa had just exposed the hole in his logic, and he knew it, but he couldn't admit it. My father stammered. Vanessa didn't wait for him to finish. She turned to Judge Brennan. "Your Honor, I would like to enter a document into evidence on behalf of the defendant." Brennan looked at her. "What is it, Counselor?" Vanessa returned to her table, opened a black metal box, and took out a file with a red cover. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I'd seen those looks before, curiosity mixed with apprehension. People in the gallery leaned forward to get a better view. Frost sat up straighter. My father narrowed his eyes. Vanessa held up the file. This document is classified under Section 104A of the Defense Information Protection Act. It contains the complete mission records of my client, Lieutenant Commander Natalie Cross, during her 14 years of service in the United States Navy. These documents have been authenticated by the Office of the Secretary of Defense and are signed by a serving Vice Admiral. Frost shot to his feet. Your Honor, I object. We have not been shown this document. Vanessa turned to him. That's because it's classified, Mr. Frost. Only a federal judge is permitted to unseal and review its contents before deciding if it can be entered into the public record. That is the law. Judge Brennan was quiet for a moment. He looked at Vanessa, then at Frost, then at me. Finally, he spoke. Bring the file to the bench. Vanessa approached the judge's bench and placed the red-covered file on it. Brennan put on his glasses. He opened the first page. The room was so silent I could hear the page turn. He read the first page, flipped to the second, then the third. Then he looked up at me. The look in his eyes had changed. It was no longer the look of a judge overseeing a trivial inheritance dispute. It was a look of respect, and something that felt a lot like astonishment. Counselor Okonkwo, he said, I'd like to see both parties in my chambers. Frost stood up. Your Honor, I must. Attorney Frost, Brennan cut in, his voice low but firm. I suggest you listen to me. Frost sat down. My father looked at me. His face was still red. But now, mixed with the red of his anger, there was another color, the paleness of bewilderment. He had no idea what was happening. He didn't know what that file was. He didn't know that his daughter, the one he thought worked an office job, had been involved in missions protected at the highest levels of the federal government. He didn't know anything. And in that moment I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel any triumph. I just felt tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of having to prove myself. Tired of spending my entire life as that same 11-year-old girl with the ugly wooden boat, waiting for a word of praise that never came. It took Judge Brennan about 3 minutes to read the red file. 3 minutes. In a crowded room, 3 minutes is nothing. Enough time to make a cup of coffee, to send a text, to take a few breaths and think about dinner. But in that courtroom, 3 minutes stretched on for what felt like 3 hours. I barely dared to breathe. Frost sat as still as a statue, not moving a muscle. My father stared at the judge, his lips pressed into a thin line. In the gallery behind us, someone coughed softly, then fell silent as if they'd just committed a crime. Vanessa sat beside me, not looking at me. She stared straight ahead, her hands on the table, fingers laced together. She'd been doing this job long enough to know that in moments like these, the best thing you can do is nothing at all. Brennan flipped the last page. Then he turned back to the first. Read it again. I wondered what he was looking for. A detail, a name, a number, a reason to doubt. But when he looked up, his face held no doubt, only certainty. He took off his glasses, set them down on the bench, and spoke. Attorney Frost. His voice wasn't loud, but in that silent room, every syllable rang like a bell. I advise your client to withdraw this lawsuit, within 24 hours. Frost shot to his feet. Your Honor, I'm not finished, Brennan cut him off. He looked directly at Frost, his old eyes sharp as a knife. If this lawsuit is not withdrawn by tomorrow, I will be forwarding this entire file to the U.S. Attorney's Office to consider criminal charges against the plaintiff. Frost went pale. Your Honor, on what grounds? Brennan held up the red file. On the grounds of this document. And on the grounds that your client has brought false allegations in court against an active-duty military officer concerning matters protected by national security, that is perjury in a federal court, which carries a sentence of up to 5 years in prison. Would you like me to read you the statute? Frost slumped back into his chair. He didn't say another word. He just looked over at my father and gave a slight shake of his head, the shake of a man who had already lost. My father wasn't looking at Frost, he was looking at me. And in that moment, he was no longer the man I used to fear. His face, which had always seemed as hard as stone, suddenly softened. His eyes were red. Not from anger. I'd seen him angry 1,000 times. When he was angry, his eyes blazed like 2 burning coals. This wasn't that. This time his eyes were wet, tired, and held something I had never seen before. Defeat. Not the defeat of a lawsuit. It was the defeat of a father realizing he was wrong, and wrong in a way that could never be fixed. My father opened his mouth. At first no sound came out. His lips moved as if trying to find the words. Then, a tiny hoarse voice like wind whistling through a crack in a door. What were you hiding, Nat? I looked at him. I looked at the man who had been silent for 38 years at the shipyard, the man who had looked at my wooden boat and just said, yeah, the man who told me that girls don't need to be strong, the man who didn't come to the airport to pick me up when I came home after my mother's death. The man who sued me because he couldn't accept that I had made something more of myself than he had. I looked at him. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to answer any of his questions. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to show him the red file. I didn't need to tell him about Anna, about the long nights in a windowless room, about the voices I heard and was never allowed to repeat. I didn't need to do anything to earn his approval anymore. Because I realized something right in that moment as he sat before me with his red-rimmed eyes and broken voice. His approval was never worth what I thought it was. I had spent my entire life chasing something he was never capable of giving, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. 38 years in that shipyard had, at least in part, boarded up his heart. I didn't answer. I just looked at him, a long look with no hate, no pity, just the look of a daughter who had learned how to live without her father. Then I turned away. My father withdrew the lawsuit the next morning. Vanessa called me at 9 o'clock. She said, "Judge Brennan signed the dismissal, it's over, Natalie." I said, "Thank you." And I hung up the phone. I didn't feel anything. Not relief, not happiness, not sadness. Just a hollow space as if someone had reached into my chest and taken something out, and I hadn't yet figured out what it was. My father didn't apologize. He didn't call, didn't write, didn't send a message through Derek. He just vanished from my life like a door closing without a sound. 6 months. 6 months of not hearing his voice. 6 months of wondering if he ever thought about me, or if I'd just become a memory he was trying to bury. Then one night, Derek called. "Dad hasn't eaten in 3 days," he said. His voice was tired, hoarse. "Are you satisfied now?" I sat on the couch in my Quincy apartment staring out the window at the empty parking lot. Rain again. "You think this makes me happy?" I asked. Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know anymore, Nat. I don't know anything." I didn't say anything else. I hung up. I didn't want my father to starve. I didn't want him to suffer. I just wanted him to see me. Not as a disappointment, not as a liar, not as a stranger, but as me, Natalie, his daughter. But that apparently was too much to ask. I decided not to keep the house. I sold my share to Derek for less than market value. A lot less. Enough so he wouldn't have to get a loan. Enough so he could get back on his feet if he chose to. I gave him one condition: Derek had to go to rehab for his gambling addiction. "I'm not an addict," he said over the phone, his voice defensive. "You are, Derek," I said. "You've lost almost $100,000 in the last 5 years. Dad paid off most of it for you. But he's out of money now. It's on you." Derek was silent, then he sighed. "You know, Nat, sometimes I hate you for always being right." "You don't hate me," I said. "You just don't know how to manage without someone helping you." Derek went to rehab, a 3-month program at a facility outside Worcester. He called me once a week. At first his voice was angry, resentful. Then slowly it softened. Then one day he called and said, "I'm sorry, Nat, for everything." I cried after that call, for the first time since the trial. A year later, my father showed up at my apartment in Boston. I'd moved from Quincy into the city by then. A small 3rd-floor place near the park with big windows that looked out onto the trees. I liked it. It wasn't home, but it was mine. A Sunday afternoon. I was making coffee when the doorbell rang. I opened the door. My father was standing there. He looked older, a lot older. His hair was almost completely gray, his face was thinner, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. He was wearing that old gray coat, holding a small box in his hands. "Hi, Dad," I said. "Hello, daughter," he replied. We stood there for a moment. He didn't come in, I didn't invite him. Just stood there, looking at each other across the threshold. Then he held up the box. "I brought you this." I took it. It was light, old, a small wooden box, the brown paint chipped at the corners. I opened it. Inside was the wooden boat. The one I'd made when I was 11. The sides weren't straight, the bow was crooked, and beads of dried glue were hardened into clear droplets. It was still ugly. But now, looking at it 25 years later, I saw something beautiful in its ugliness. "I threw this in the trash," I said. "I know," my father replied. "Then why did you keep it?" He was silent, a long, heavy silence, like the ones in the courtroom that day. But this time there was no judge, no lawyers, no audience. Just a father and a daughter, standing at a threshold. Then he said, his voice very quiet, very hoarse, as if he had to fight for every word, "Your mother told me to keep it." I looked at him. "Mom told you to keep it. But you kept it, there's a difference." My father said nothing. "So why did you keep it?" I asked. He looked down at the floor, then out into the hallway, then back at the box in my hands. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Because I don't know how to say I'm sorry." The words escaped him like a final breath, soft, almost invisible, but I heard them. I heard them. I just stood there, holding the box, looking at this man who had been silent for 70 years. He still couldn't say he was sorry. But this time, he admitted that he didn't know how, and for me that was almost enough. I didn't say, "I forgive you, Dad." And I didn't say, "I can't forgive you." Those words felt too heavy, and at the same time, too light to mean anything real. I just closed the box, held it to my chest, and said, "I know, Dad." My father nodded. He stood there for another moment as if he wanted to say something else, but then he turned and walked down the stairs. I didn't call him back. I stood at the door watching until he disappeared around the bend. The sound of his slow, heavy footsteps echoed up the concrete stairwell, and then silence. I closed the door. I put the box on the table, opened it again. I took out the wooden boat and looked at it in the light. It was still ugly. But it was mine, it had always been mine. I still have that wooden boat. It isn't beautiful, it isn't perfect, just like my family, just like my relationship with my father. Just like any story about kinship, there are always cracks, pieces that don't quite fit, sharp edges that hurt when you touch them. But I keep it. Not because it's valuable, but because it reminds me that sometimes the most precious thing isn't perfection, it's not forgiveness or a neatly spoken apology. Sometimes the most precious thing is simply that someone didn't throw you away. Even when they could never bring themselves to say they love you.